It's time for Freology Friday. I'm Derrick Day, and he is.
I am Aaron Tomlinson. You're looking mighty sharp tonight there, bro.
Thank you, man. I want to give a shout out to my buddy Tori Ruffin and his band Freak Juice. They're going to be playing at the Download downtown Tulsa. So if you're in Tulsa and you got some time to kill and some money to burn, come on down there and join me for a drink or two and some live music. It's going to be. I'm going to tell you something. Tori is amazing. He is the lead guitarist for Morris Day and the Time, as well as an accomplished performer and writer, composer in his own right. So get down there. So that's that.
Awesome.
And what's in the glass tonight, man?
Well, I'm still recovering, so I'm drinking eggnog without the bourbon or vodka or whatever rum, whatever you put in
Yeah,
eggnog.
that's okay. I mean, because what you were telling me about the weather there, eggnog is like the perfect drink.
Yes, we. I think it's been 3 days of snow, and I don't know. It's hard to say because it started melting right away. But I would guess we've gotten 2.5 feet, maybe 3 feet of snow. We've probably accumulated a foot and a half, maybe 2 feet. So yeah, probably about 3 feet of snow.
Yeah.
And it's still coming down.
Wow.
So I'm getting ready for the holidays, man.
It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas.
Exactly. Exactly.
So for me, it's just some what is this Sauvignon Blanc.
All right.
Yeah. So
Sounds good.
going light because I'm going to go out and I'll probably have a couple of more drinks tonight and
Sure.
try to keep it all in the road, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Exactly.
so tonight, I think that this is my subject to introduce,
Mhm.
and and I'm smiling and everything, but this is a very serious subject,
Mhm.
and I want to talk about dealing with loss, grieving, and I mean, grieving is a part of life for humanity, and the interesting thing is there's a lot that has been written. There's been a lot that's been said about grief, and some people have like a cookie cutter approach to grief that
Mhm.
we all the grieving should look like this,
Mhm.
and it doesn't. Grieving is a very personal thing. It's like faith, and because of that, it's different for everybody. It looks different. It manifests differently. It's expressed differently, and I think that one of the keys to empathy is understanding that people's grieving process is different.
Mhm.
Um, I remember years ago. For those of you who don't know, I was married before, and my wife died of cancer in '94, and and there were people that they meant well. Like they would say, okay, um, you should wait a year before you start dating again, and you shouldn't spend too much time being down and depressed, and everybody meant well. Now, I don't think that anybody's heart was in the wrong place that was telling me anything, but everybody had this idea of how we should grieve. Now, fast forward, my uncle Bill, who was my uncle through my deceased wife, he recently passed away. He passed away on October the 10th. It was his birthday. It was I think it was his 81st birthday that he died on. But Uncle Bill told me something back when my wife died, and he said, "Listen, man," he said, "don't let anybody tell you how to manage your grief.
Mhm.
Everybody goes through it differently, and just like you need to understand how they grieve, they need to understand how you grieve, and the two may be totally different."
Yeah.
And I want to touch on this like on two two prongs of the fork, right? One is we grieve people. We don't always grieve people. We could grieve the loss of a loved one for sure, a friend or a relative, but we can grieve the loss of a job, the loss of a business. We can grieve over the loss of of a critical game or something like that.
Sure.
And in the context, and this is the other fork, is macro grieving,
Mm-hmm.
which we experienced in the election on
Yeah.
Tuesday. And I don't want to get too deep in the weeds on the election. That's past. I want to move on from that, literally and figuratively. But um, how do we process grief? First of all, I want to say this to everybody, that grief is necessary. It
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely necessary. Um, I've seen people that I'll never forget. Like when my dad's mother died, my grandmother. When she died, it was a packed house in the church in Decatur, Illinois. It's a packed house. As my grandmother was very well known as a gospel singer, and so it's a packed house, standing room only, and not a dry eye in the house except my dad.
Mm.
My dad was just sitting up there like solid as a rock, you know. And years later, as an adult, I asked him about that because I remember I have this great memory of childhood events. And so I asked him, I said, what's the deal, man? I said, because if it was my mom, I'd be, falling out, they'd have to, throw me in the casket with her, kind of thing. And he said, I did cry, son. He said, but I cried before the funeral. He said, I got it all out and I got myself together. And I said, this is something that was personal to him. He said, nobody need to see my grief. And I said, okay. That was a lesson too. Because I remember, like, again, when my wife died, like, we had two different services for her. We had one down in Virginia where we were living, and then we had one in New Jersey where she was from. And at the one in Virginia, man, I clowned. I just straight clowned. I mean, I cried, I hollered. I mean, I was broken. But when we got to New Jersey, I was better. I think I managed I managed myself better. But the whole thing that I want to talk about is grieving is a necessary process, because for one thing, if you don't grieve, you internalize something. You internalize a loss. You internalize something that's hurting you, and when you do that, you run the risk of doing both mental and
Mm-hmm.
physical harm to yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So you got to get it out. That's the one thing. And then the second thing is how you get it out. That's your business. That's totally on you. Nobody has the right to tell you how you should get it out, how it should manifest. So that's where I want to start off with about grief,
Yeah.
about loss.
Yeah, you make a lot of really great points there. One thing I want to highlight that you said initially is that grief doesn't always. We always think of grief in terms of funerals and death and stuff
Yep.
like that. But like you were saying, it's any kind of loss, any kind of, lost opportunity, or you mentioned the election. For a lot of people, that represents a lost future, a potential future you vote for the future, you vote for what you believe in.
Mm-hmm.
Your candidate loses, especially when the visions are so different, right?
Yep.
Then you grieve what might have been. It's even okay to, you don't necessarily have to grieve something that you had and lost, but it's okay to grieve what could have been or what might have been.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, we've talked a lot about religious deconstruction and stuff, and I think a lot of people who devote years and decades of their life to causes or things, and they don't see the progress, or they wake up and realize this isn't what I thought it was, can end up grieving for what could have been, what could have been if I had spent my time, energy, effort, money doing something else besides doing those things. So grief, and that's what makes grief so personal, right? So highlighting, just piggybacking off another thing that you said, that's what makes grief so personal.
Yeah.
And you talked about the importance of grieving. And one of the things that I'm of the persuasion of, is that we really can't control our emotions. What I mean by that is, or control our feelings. We can control our behaviors. So you use the example of your father. He was feeling the grief. He was feeling the emotions, and he controlled his behavior. I let it out ahead of time. I got it all out before the funeral, so I wasn't doing it in the funeral. People don't need to see my grief, right? So
Yep.
controlling the behaviors, or if you get angry, you can restrain that anger. You don't have to go hit somebody. You don't have to cuss somebody out just because you're angry, right?
Right.
And I'm not shaming anybody that's cussed anybody out lately. Or if you lose control of your behavior because of your emotions, we all do that. That's just part of being human. But I don't know that we can control our feelings. They just are responses to life. And I think it's like you, I think it's extremely emotionally unhealthy to try to control those responses that we have emotionally to life. In other words, I'm not going to feel this, or I am going to feel this. You know, when my father died, of course, my father had a very protracted, long illness. But when he finally passed away, I didn't grieve in the traditional sense. I couldn't make myself cry. And I loved my dad. It wasn't like, we had a good relationship. So it wasn't like, like, oh, good, the guy's finally dead or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I didn't go all Marshall Mathers on him and want to pick him up and cuss him out, right? Some people will get that.
Yeah.
So, it wasn't like that. So it bothered me for a while that I, wasn't feeling. And that's when I really started to realize, like, you can't make the heart, like, the heart has a mind of its own. You can't make it fall in love. You can't make it not fall in love. You can't make it grieve. You can't stop it from grieving. And so I think it's really important that we hold space for people who are grieving. And what I mean by holding space is, let's be honest, sometimes we give people platitudes because their expression of grief or their feelings make us feel uncomfortable. And what we're really doing, and I'm not saying we're doing this intentionally, I'm not saying we're doing this from a bad place, we're just human beings. What we're really doing sometimes is trying to comfort ourselves by taking away the discomfort that we have because I'm in the presence of your discomfort.
Right.
Or I love you. Like, it could be as simple as this. It's not necessarily something diabolical, right? It's not like I'm just being selfish and I'm worried about what I'm feeling. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying I love you. I care about you. You're my friend. You're my brother. You're, whatever that person's relationship is with you. And I don't want you hurting. And I want to see you happy because I love you. So it hurts me that you're hurting. Makes me feel uncomfortable that you're discouraged. I don't like to see you like this. So instead of holding space for that process, I might come along with encouragement too soon, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
The encouragement itself isn't bad, but we can do it too soon. You know what I mean? Yeah. And when you do it too soon, it's incredibly invalidating to the other person. It's telling the other person you're not okay to not be okay.
Right.
And again, oftentimes we're doing that, I think, because you're not being okay makes me feel not okay. And I don't like that feeling. And so I want to change that feeling within myself. So I'm trying to get you out of that space. And so I think just holding space for people is saying it's okay to not be okay right now. Every feeling that you're feeling right now is a valid experience. It's a valid phenomenon. It's valid for you to feel this way. And not every circumstance or situation is every behavioral response going to be necessarily something that we want to affirm or that kind of stuff, but affirming the person and affirming their experience and allowing them the space to experience those things and express themselves, I think is part of empathy and part of holding space and part of providing comfort and being there for people. And, I guess that's part of this too, not just what do we do when we're grieving, but how do we handle grief when other people are grieving and we're not? And then also, what do we do when there's corporate grief and everybody's grieving?
Yeah.
That's in our circle, that's in our sphere.
Yep. And, like you were talking about keeping space for, and I think that's important, holding space for what you're grieving about. And that kind of turns back to sitting with your emotions, right? I think that it's important for us to sit with our emotions and just kind of contemplate. And I think this is an exercise in mindfulness, right? Because you're sitting down and you're evaluating how you feel. You're running a diagnostic check on yourself. And I think that that's really important. But when you talk about sitting with your feelings when you're grieving, there's a Jewish custom that's called sitting Shiva.
Mm-hmm.
That when someone dies, people come over to the house of the deceased and they just sit with the loved ones. They don't say anything.
Mm-hmm.
The objective is not to try to offer words of comfort or it's just to sit with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things that I've learned about grieving, because see, just like there is no textbook way to grieve, there's no textbook way to react to how people grieve.
Sure.
But you can mitigate any potential damage that you might do during their grieving process by sometimes just sitting with them.
Yeah.
Because that person has to sit with their emotions. They have to evaluate how they're feeling. They have to evaluate how this emotion is affecting their thinking, their breathing,
Yeah.
their being. And they have to evaluate that. So sometimes it's better. And this is my thing. This is something that I've learned because I've always been that guy that everybody turns to for a word of comfort. And what I learned was that sometimes saying something, even with the best of intentions, even when it's properly timed, even when it's properly phrased, properly worded, it may still provide a challenge to the hearer. So sometimes I've learned that silence it should be, let me put it this way. I've learned that when it comes to grief and when you're dealing with someone who's grieving, that the default mode when addressing them should be silence.
Yeah.
Don't say anything until it's necessary.
Yeah.
And so I have an analogy. Because when you look at sheet music, right? You see the notes. The notes are sounds, and they're sounds at different pitches, different tones that produce some melody. But if you just string together a bunch of notes, what you get is noise. No matter how melodic it is, it's noise. But if you carefully place rests in between the notes, you create a composition, you create something, you create actual music, you create an actual melody. And that's what I think when we are dealing with people who are grieving, that we should think of, how can I provide the rest? Because you're going to get a lot of noise. People are going to get a lot of noise when they're grieving. They're going to produce a lot of noise when they're grieving, and sometimes they need a well-timed rest.
Mm.
And I'm being I'm serving up a double entendre here, right? Because it's not just rest in terms of the pauses of silence, but it actually ministers rest to the soul of the hearer.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're going to get a lot of noise when you're grieving, and this is whether it's micro grieving, which micro grieving is when it's a specific person, it's a specific thing. You're mourning the loss of a loved one, you're mourning the loss of a business, you're mourning the loss of a car. I mean, we all mourn different things, right? And so that's dealing with macro or micro loss, right? But then there's macro loss, which the election is a shining example of that, because we right now, and I know that our folks on the Republican side of things would tend to disagree with this, but we are a nation in mourning right now.
Mm-hmm.
Fully half of the country is in mourning. So how do you deal with that? And when you think about this, um, the hallmark of good leadership is to be able to speak to that macro loss. Especially if you're the victor. If you're the victor, then it's incumbent upon you to salve the wounds of the side that was defeated, because that's how healing happens, right? And I'm hoping, I could be wrong, but I'm hoping that that's what's going to happen. I'm hoping. I want to stay hopeful, and I want to give a shout out to our friend and brother Kyle Butler. Kyle called me. Kyle called me to check on me. He was just like, he said, brother, he said, you seem like you're hurting, and he was right.
Yeah.
But the thing is that what true leadership does in that situation. I remember, in winning a key football game, that the coach of the team that I played for would always go to the sideline of the team that he beat, and he hugged the coach, shake his hand, tell him, hey man, thank you for this great game. Get not rubbing his face in it or anything. It was just, being conciliatory. And so when you talk about macro grief, there has to be someone or a group of someones who step in and stand in that gap and say, hey, I understand how you feel, but something, we're going to work all of this out together. We're going to work all of it out. So anyway, that's kind of like, that's kind of where I am, like with the, micro grief and macro grief. It's like when it comes to micro grief and you're dealing with someone who's micro grieving, default mode should be silence. Don't go in there. And, we have this tendency, and I know I'm guilty of this a lot, and I try not to be. I try to be more mindful of this. But, we go into situations, in conversations, looking to respond and not to listen. Right?
Yeah.
But
right.
when it comes to grief, oh my God, that's it. It is critical that you be in a listening mode. But that's where I'll stop.
Yeah. So just shifting gears a little bit. What do you do if you're grieving, without getting into prescriptions and, because then it'd just be a contradiction, right? We both agree that everybody has differences in the way that they're going to grieve and the way that they're going to express themselves. Everybody's going to experience it differently, and there's no right or wrong way to go about doing it. Except I think we might agree on this point, and that is that stuffing it is not healthy. Ignoring it is not healthy. Pretending it doesn't exist is not probably the best approach.
Completely agree.
So I want to talk about that a little bit, because I've seen people, I've counseled people, I've worked with people who, there's the typical, 6 stages of grief or something, and denial is one of those stages. And I've seen people experience devastating losses, sudden losses, and stay in denial for years, literally years, about the loss. And maybe because they're trying to avoid all the other different aspects of it. Or I've had people in the counseling room who start to have an emotion rise up as a result of unfinished business they're working on. And by unfinished business, that's exactly what I mean. Something that wasn't fully processed and integrated, or an emotion that wasn't fully experienced in the time of that emotion. So one of the definitions of grief that I heard that I really like is grief helps us to transition from what was or what could have been to what is. And good. We can't necessarily just do it like an on-off switch, right?
Yep.
So there needs to be some transition. And so it can be the emotions or stages that we pass through while we're transitioning from what was or what could have been to what is or what will be, right? So if you think about, typically when we talk about losing someone, losing a relationship, um, regardless of that reason, you know, that they died or moved away or divorced or you had a falling out, whatever it is, you're transitioning from life with that person to life without that person.
Yeah.
And if you stifle your emotions, if you stuff your emotions, then you're prolonging the transition. Or for a lot of us, especially when we were kids, we didn't have the skills or the tools or the adults around us to know how to process
Mm.
certain events or certain emotions. And so it can get stuck in there. And so I've worked with people where, and that's what I call unfinished business, right? Where they start to experience an emotion about something that's unfinished business, and they'll try to stuff it and they'll try to hold it down. And I'll encourage them, that's what we do in here. That's the kind of work that we're doing. Don't stuff it. Don't suppress it. And I've had people tell me really interesting things. I've had people say, well, I'm afraid, because I'll ask them, what happens? What are you afraid of? Are you afraid I'm judging you? You're afraid you're embarrassed? What is this about? For a lot of people, it's, I'm afraid if I let it go, I won't be able to stop. If I let it out, I won't be able to stop. Now, some people, they've had real bouts of depression and suicide and stuff like that. And so they've got some very valid reasons for saying, I don't want to go to that dark place again. I'm afraid if I let my feelings out, let myself feel these things, I'm going to get back into a really dark place. But I think as a general rule, and just generally speaking, we can say that it can be unhealthy to avoid those painful emotions, to not sit with them or to prolong them and drag them out. And so one of the things that I found helpful for me, and really when I think about the deep losses that I've experienced in my life, once I learned this, it made the grieving process a lot easier for me. So again, I'm not telling anyone this is how they have to do it, just saying this is what worked for me. It's almost to exaggerate the emotion that I'm feeling in grief. And I kind of took this from the Bible and this idea, I don't know if it's true or not, so much stuff that we said in the culture of the day, in the Jewish culture, they used to do this. And then I find out that's all bullshit. So we said that, picked it up and kept repeating it. And so we believe it. But that they would hire wailers, to come. They'd pay people to come in and wail.
Professional mourners.
Yeah. Or Job, wearing sackcloth and cutting on himself. Of course, I'm not advocating for self-harm in any way, but you can see he's letting himself express that. He's giving expression, not holding it in, almost ramping it up, hiring people to come in and mourn with us. And so one of the things, if I'm privately going through a painful loss, I found wailing can really help, instead of just sitting there letting the tears stream down. If I really lean into that emotion and really, almost like I said, exaggerate the expression of that. And this may just be a white person problem, because I don't know. I mean, one of the differences between like preaching in a white church and a black church, or going to a white funeral and a black funeral, is y'all express yourself.
Yeah.
Whereas we don't so much, we'll sit there. I mean, a white funeral is crazy, because we just sit there and grab our tissues. And again, I'm not criticizing anyone. I'm just noting the differences. And one of the things that I felt has helped me as a white person is exaggerating that grief, allowing myself to really go through that. And also when those emotions come up, allowing myself to feel them. I remember I was last January or February, I was doing some early spring cleaning, right? I was getting some stuff done around the house that I had been putting off. And I was listening to a wide variety of music. I have pretty eclectic tastes. And so for whatever reason, I was listening to Simon and Garfunkel. And my parents had an 8-track tape when I was growing up that was Simon and Garfunkel.
Wow.
That they would listen to. And one of the songs came on, and it just took me back to a moment in time when I was a child. And it was a good memory. And the fact that time was gone, all of a sudden, just a wave of emotion out of nowhere just came up, right? This wave of emotion, this wave of grief. And I went ahead and worked with it. I let myself have that moment. I let myself experience it. I think my wife even came down the middle and she's like, "What's wrong?" I'm like, "Oh, it's a Simon and Garfunkel song." And but and in that moment, I was not only grieving the loss, that both my parents are not here anymore, but even to some degree, a loss of good times, a loss of better times, a loss of childhood innocence. All of that was wrapped up in that moment. And so I think being able to ride the waves is an important aspect of grief. So anyway, I'll shut up. I'll quit with my monologue, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on some of that.
No, that's really good. And it's funny how sometimes, we think that we've grieved. We think that we've got it all out of our system. And then something comes up that triggers it, right? And I know, like, my grandmother used to love Jackie Wilson.
Hmm.
And that was, if there was an artist that she could listen to over and over again, it was Jackie Wilson. And so whenever I hear like Lonely Teardrops,
Hmm.
There's an emotional thing that happens with me. I love the song. But I can hear my grandmother singing that song,
Yeah.
and it makes me realize that, okay, this is, I don't know, 53 years ago.
Wow.
53 years ago, and it's still like I have these moments. So the other thing too is that grief doesn't have an expiration date.
Right. It's a good point.
Really
good point.
You can life can be going on. It's just like my godfather passed away a little over a year ago. And so his son, my godbrother, I talked to him and he said, man, it's really something how the Lions are doing so good this season, and normally this would be something I'd be able to talk with Dad about, and I can't. There's always going to be these triggers. So here you were, you're doing spring cleaning, and how long had it been since your mom passed away?
7 years, 8 years, something like that.
And suddenly you're overwhelmed with emotion because it took you back to something that it was a shared experience. So shared experiences.
That's a good point.
Once they've been broken, where you no longer have the shared experience.
Yeah.
There are certain things that can trigger an emotional response because that shared experience, you have that what would normally have been a shared experience is now you're having it in solitude.
Yeah.
And that's hard because one of the beautiful things about shared experiences are that they are shared, right? It's not just your emotional content, but it's the emotional content of everyone else that's having the shared experience.
Yeah.
But once you take one of these people out of the equation, and let me say this about that, because it doesn't necessarily have to be death, right? Because I have friends that or loved ones that I've been estranged from, and I'll think about something and it gets me all emotional because I'm not having that shared experience with them. So the two things that I would say to take away from that is, number one, like I said, grief doesn't have an expiration date, and the second one is that you have to remember that shared experiences are not permanent. That there's going to be a time when the shared experience, the emotion of the shared experience, the feel, the excitement or the sadness or whatever of the shared experience is no longer going to be there because that other person that you shared it with, they're not going to be there. And you have to be prepared for that. That's something that that you have to deal with. And that's another thing too, is that a lot of times people don't understand the shared experience. And let me say this about that. Sometimes there are people out here that I think try to keep shared experiences at arm's length. In other words, they prefer to have, emotional experiences on their own
Mm.
or with as few people as possible.
Yeah.
So when it does happen, they treat this as sort of like a circuit breaker or a protective mechanism. So I don't feel I won't feel this grief. And I think that you do yourself a disservice when you do that, because we're created to have shared experiences. I mean, it's like,
Mm.
Aaron, I'll talk about how you teach on consciousness and how consciousness is a field. It's a global, uh, you know, uh, energy manifestation, right? So that means that really all of humanity is having a shared experience, and you can't divorce yourself from that in the macro sense. But I think that in order to really understand it at the macro sense, that you have to understand that these same shared experiences happen at a micro level, and you can't deny yourself that.
Yeah.
And so I feel sorry for the people who try to deny themselves the micro experiences, the shared experiences, because they're trying to protect themselves emotionally. I think that part of part of grieving is vulnerability, transparency. It's a moment when you should be able to share your emotions without judgment, without fear. I mean, this is the moment where you should expect not to be taken advantage of, right? So I think that we have to remember that, again, everything has an expiration date, and then the other thing, the shared experiences are not permanent. They're fleeting. What did we used to preach back in the days when we were preaching that everyone comes into your life for a reason, a season, or a lifetime, right?
Yeah.
And you have to remember that some people come into your life as a reason, and those reasons are either they're a lesson or a blessing. you know and there's a shared experience that comes from that, or a season. uh, you work with someone for 20 years, right? And that's the season can be a week, it could be 20 years. And then there's some people that are just there, I mean, forever. And I think about this, like, you got to meet my oldest friend, Leon Mims. Leon and I, we've been friends for 60 years. 60. Like, and that's mind-blowing when you sit up and think about it. But
Yeah.
that's, lifetime, a lifetime relationship. I mean, that's how we've been together literally all of our lives.
Yeah.
So I think that, remembering that the shared experience is going to come and go. And I think that at a certain point, in order um, to really savor the experience, that's just like a good bottle of wine, right? What makes it a good bottle of wine is that it's not always going to be there.
Hmm.
Because if it's always there, it's like water. It's ubiquitous. It's
Yeah.
you take it for granted. But when you have a really good bottle of wine, you know that at a certain point that bottle is gone.
Yeah.
And now, I'm lamenting I drank all of that wine. It was really good. And that's the way we need to look at shared experiences, is that we have to understand that they are finite, you
Hmm.
know, and that they will go away. So
Mhm. So much wisdom there. That's what I love about you. You're always spouting wisdom. I mean,
so are you, man. I mean,
we
I'm
could do
just
we could do a whole episode on the power of shared experiences. Um, one of the things I'm just still thinking about that memory, and then as you're talking, the Simon and Garfunkel memory, which I gotta say, I remembered that my dad, like, one of his, I would venture to say one of his top 5 all time favorite movies was The Graduate. I don't know why he liked that movie so much, but that's probably where the love for Simon and Garfunkel came from.
Are you trying to seduce me, Mrs. Robinson?
Yeah, exactly. Uh, so anyway, um, but what's interesting is that good memories and thinking about good memories can also produce grief because we're not there anymore.
Yeah.
And so that can be weird too, right? Like, oh, I remember my uncle when he was getting. I've had some men in my family that have had a lot of longevity, and he was getting into his 90s, and everything was. His heart was working great, his lungs were working great, all his vital organs were working great. Everything else, not so much.
Mm.
So I did decide early on in my life, I'm going to live a little because I don't want to do all this health nutty stuff. And my heart's ticking away, but I'm blind and deaf and my knees
Well, you're
ache.
in great shape and you got dementia,
Yeah, exactly. But he would sit there and he would call my dad and he'd reminisce with my dad because they were cousins. We called him uncle, but they were cousins.
Mhm.
And he would call and reminisce about things from their childhood or, those shared experiences. And he'd say, I can't remember what I did yesterday, but I can sure lay there in bed and I can remember, all these important moments and shared experiences. And he would revel in that. But for some people, and I tend to be more like this, when I think about good times and good memories, there can be grief that comes with that because it's like, man, those were such good times. I miss those days. You know what I mean? I miss those times. I miss those people. I miss the experiences. I miss the people that I shared them with. Because even if they're still in my life, they're not the same person, right? We all grow and develop and change. And so it can be a weird thing where you're holding something as wonderful and good and cherished, but at the same time grieving over it because it's a moment you'll never get back. It's a moment you'll never have again.
You just brought up something, man, and I think that this is key. And I think nobody really thinks about this, right? But you and I, in the last, let's say, 5 or 6 years, have undergone some significant changes in our thinking,
Yeah.
in our believing, in our philosophy.
Yeah.
And I know that people around us, they grieve the person that we were.
So good. So true. So true.
And I had a conversation with a buddy of mine. I'm gonna go ahead and say his name, Stephen White, Bishop Stephen White. Yeah. So I was talking with him because I hadn't seen him on social media in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
And so I said, okay, well, let me just make sure Steve's still alive.
Yeah.
Because we're getting up in years. And you just gotta check sometimes.
Sure. Right. Yeah.
So we're talking and everything. And he told me, he said, he said, I remember when you first started going down the atheist path. And he said, I started getting all these phone calls from people, like what's going on with your boy Dave? What's going on? And he would be like, listen, he said, Derrick is still the same guy. He's changed how he approaches things, but the essence of his character, of his personality is still there.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me last night, and it's like one of these moments like where you hear that and you're just like, oh my God, I want to cry. But he was like, he said, dude, he said, I tell people there's more Christ in you than in a lot of these, so-called preachers. And I'm humbled by that. But I know that like there were a lot of my preacher friends that swept me away, kicked me to the curb because I had gone through these spiritual changes. and a lot of it was because they were grieving the loss of what they thought they had in me, or how my personality was manifest.
Right. Yep.
So, I just wanted to throw that out there. I'm gonna kick that back over to you.
Well, I wonder if that's why sometimes people make it so hard, or we make it hard on other people to change. I wonder if we try to hold people in boxes because we like the person that they are and we don't want them to change. We don't want them to grow. We don't want them to move on from a shared experience, from a moment in time. It's not necessarily even they're moving on from us, but they could be moving on from who they were in a moment in time that is special to us, that is meaningful to us. And we may want to keep them in that moment,
Mm-hmm.
right? And therefore not allow them to grow. One of the best, we're going to be celebrating 30 years of marriage. And one of the best things, thank you. One of the best things that I ever heard about a relationship, because you know when you spend that much time with somebody and you go through relationships, like I don't want my wife staying with me because she has to. You know, I don't ever want it to be this thing of, well, I pledged before God and everybody, and so therefore I have to stay. I mean, who wants that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, I want God to put a gun to your head and make you stay with me. I mean,
Right.
that's pretty fucked up when you think about it. Like, you got to stay with me because you said you were going to stay with me.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's just
Yep.
fucked up. Um, so you know, don't want that. And I remember people telling me when I was younger, even when you're getting married, you know, you're going to change. You're getting married too young. You're going to change. You're going to go through so many changes in your life. And it's true. And especially if you're committed to growth and personal development and that kind of stuff, you're going to go through changes. And so, one of the best definitions of a relationship that I heard that can last is you both are growing together. That
Mhm.
doesn't mean that you're growing at the same rate or growing in the same direction,
Right.
but you're allowing for that growth and that change to happen, and you're still able to honor that person and value that person in spite of the changes, in spite of the growth, in spite of, you know, you're not trying to keep them locked into a moment or a shared experience that you prefer, but
Right.
you're allowing them to grow and express themselves. And that's something I think that is a real key to a relationship if you want it to last, or because I don't do this thing with lasting relationships. Like, I remember being at a specific 50th wedding anniversary and thinking everybody's, you know, congratulating them. And I'm thinking, because I knew the couple well enough to know they weren't happy together. They made each other miserable.
Yeah.
And it's like, we're celebrating 50 years of you guys making each other unhappy. Like, there's something wrong with this.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with this picture. You know, I kept that to myself. I never expressed that, but definitely what I was thinking. And so I don't necessarily think, you know, longevity is the goal. But if you want to have longevity, or if you don't have longevity, if you're trying to decide, is it time to go? Is it time to leave? Is it time to leave or is it time to stay? I think the question to ask yourself is, am I allowed to move and grow and move in the direction? Is there freedom? Is there freedom in this relationship? If there's not freedom in this relationship, then it's probably not worth staying in.
Right.
And that can be hard because the world, here I'm sounding like a Christian again, but it's true. The world, society teaches us that relationships, committed relationships, lasting relationships, long-term relationships are all about being bound. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Loss of freedom, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, rather than expression of freedom.
You bring up a really good point. You know, you're talking about somebody that's married for 50 years and they don't want to be. You know, they would love to be out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a time when letting go and grieving is a better alternative than trying to hold on.
Yeah.
You know,
Great way to bring that back around to grieving.
yeah,
But you're right.
no, but that's
100% right.
no, you just you set it up, man. I just hit the ball. That's all.
Good. It's good. Yeah, talk more about that because the people need to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, because you know, a lot of times we hold on to things well beyond the time that they should be, and that's hard because one of the reasons why we hold on to things because they comfort us. You know, we hold on to things because there are unresolved issues. We hold on to things because you know the thought of loss seems to be overwhelming, right? And I'm going to give kind of a grim example here, right? You know, when James Brown died, you know that James Brown wasn't buried for almost a year after he died
I didn't know that.
because he had, you know, his wife that didn't want to let him go, you know, his kids that were an ex-wife that they were fighting over the estate. And so meanwhile, it's like this undertaker's got to basically care for this body, you know, for almost a year.
Wow.
And that's horrible. You know, at some point, you know, at some point, finally, they got to the point where they were able to let him go, and he was able to literally rest in peace, right? But that's the thing, you know, we hold on, like we hold on to dead things, and that's another thing too. Like when people lose a loved one, um, and they're saying, okay, like I need companionship. But they'll say, I don't want to have this companionship because I don't want to offend my kids, or I don't want to offend my spouse's siblings or parents or whatever. And so you wind up subjecting yourself to loneliness because you're holding on to something that's dead.
So
And
good.
and so at some point you have to you have to release. Let me say this. I learned something. I learned something in having to bury a spouse, and it was this, that you don't hold on to anything too tightly, right? You have to hold on to things somewhat loosely, and um, my buddy Eric, who was a Navy SEAL, I was training with him before I developed my heart problem. Um, Eric would always have me, you know, traversing ladder bars. That was a big thing in training for him. And when I was, you know, when I was training in the military, that was a big thing there also. And in order to traverse the ladder bars, you have to let go of one bar to get to the next bar.
Sure.
And if you don't let go, if you cling too tightly, and that's the other thing too, you have to remember to, you want to grip tightly enough to hold on to the bar, but loosely enough that you can release and move on to the next bar quickly, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're getting this rhythm. That's the way life is. You're think of it as you're trying. Life is like crossing a ladder bar. And in order to do that, you're going to have to let some things go to move on to the next thing. It's like if you have, I think about this like, I have crazy analogies, but bear with me, right? One of my favorite shows growing up was the Beverly Hillbillies.
Yeah.
You know, and the Beverly Hillbillies. What made the show funny was not so much that they're hillbillies living in Beverly Hills, it's that all of their old ways, they clung to them
Right.
in the midst of this super rich neighborhood. And that was what created the comic tension of the show.
Yeah. Right.
And it's the abnormality of it all that made it funny. Now, here's the thing: life doesn't really work that way, right? When you move on to something like you can't take the hood into a gated community. You have to shed that mindset in order to operate in this new venue that you're in. And that's part of the problem that we suffer from in humanity, is that we hold on to dead things, or to old things, or to things that don't matter anymore, things that don't apply here, and we
Right.
cling to those because, hey, this gives me comfort. Hey, this is all I knew. This is, you know, and you come up with all these reasons, but at a certain point, you have to grieve. You have to leave where you were and grieve where you were in order to move on to the next thing. And I would say one more thing about this. Like one time when I was, I had just got out of the Navy,
Mhm.
And at that time, this was before Mickey and I had got married. And I took her to Detroit for the first time, and so she was over there with Leon's wife, my god sister, and they were, they're hanging out doing their thing, and me and Leon, we went back to our old neighborhood, back to where we grew up, right next door to each other, right, and so we're riding down Homer Street, and we get to Finkel, which is the first main street as you're heading north, and and I saw a whole bunch of our old friends. They're standing on the corner, they're smoking weed, and they're drinking. And so I see them and I hit the horn on the car and I'm like, yo, what's up? What's up? And Leon leaned over, he put his foot on top of my foot and gassed the car into the intersection. And he said, look, he said, we don't live here anymore. He said, we don't live here anymore. We moved on. They're still doing the same shit that we were doing when we were 14. We moved on. He said, you don't stay where you were, where you already moved on from. And that was a powerful lesson to me because, but here's the thing. At that point, I grieved where I came from.
Yeah.
But I had to grieve it in order to move on into what was ultimately my destiny. Because Leon taught me a lesson with his left foot. Because I'm driving the car.
Such a beautiful
and
analogy.
he leans over. He puts his foot across the tunnel and slams his foot onto my foot. And I'm like, And I have to drive through this.
I love it. And it's so true. I mean, I know we need to start wrapping it up, but it's so true to think about opportunities that we miss out on because we're avoiding the grief of letting go of the past, even something that's bad, even something that's, in other words, it's not enjoyable. We're miserable, like a couple I was saying, they spent 50 years making each other miserable. They could have moved on.
Yeah.
They could have moved on 20, 25 years probably, or 30 years before they did. Right.
Yeah.
But we can cling to the comfort of what we know rather than have to go through the grieving process of letting that go and then also embracing the fear of the unknown, maybe in some degree, right? So I love that. I love the analogy of like accelerate. Let's get through this. And the one thing I would say, I do think while we cannot control, I started out, this will be my last thing I have to say on the topic for tonight, but well, I do believe, and I said, I don't think we can control our feelings. And by control our feelings, I mean what we are actually feeling.
Right.
It sounds weird to say that. You can't control your feelings. I don't mean your feelings are an excuse to be an asshole. I want to be clear about that.
Yeah.
But we can't control what we're feeling, right? But even though we can't control it, I think we can influence it and maybe even hit the accelerator on it by allowing ourselves to experience that. So if I'm going to delay my grief because I don't want to feel it, I'm going to lengthen the process and the time it takes to get through that intersection, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
To leave where I was. Because grief is that transitional process between what was and what now is.
Yeah.
And I want to take that scenic route, man. I want to take that scenic route to where I was, visit the neighborhood that I was in, and I don't want to feel those feelings. But
it's okay to pass through. You just don't want to stop and dwell there.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I think by allowing yourself to have your feelings and experience those feelings and express those feelings, there are ways we can step on the gas to get to where we want to be sooner and get through those unpleasant seasons faster. So that'd be the last thing I have to say on it.
So here's my last thing, because you said something there that we completely glossed over this or passed over this, right? And it's this, that you grieving does not give you a license to be an asshole. It does not. You have to remember that even though you're grieving, even though you're in pain, even though you're hurting, it doesn't give you a license to abuse or injure anyone else.
Right.
Similarly, that if you're experiencing or dealing with someone who's grieving, this is not your opportunity to be an asshole. I mean, so I want to say this, that in grieving,
Yeah.
or in dealing with someone who's grieving, that the inner asshole absolutely needs to be suppressed. And that's where I'll stop.
All right. Sounds good. Yeah, I think decorum. I think if I grieve anything about where our country is, and there's lots. I mean, we could do a whole episode. We talked about it even beforehand. You know, like I was just like, I don't have the stomach to talk about America, where we're at, and all that stuff. But if there's one thing I'm grieving, it's the loss of decency, decorum,
civility.
Yeah. When I was thinking that when you were talking about the coach going across and hugging the other coach, in victory or defeat, you know, there's a certain decorum, and we were taught that. We were taught that as kids. You know, it's really important. And then as I got older, it was kind of mocked. You know, it's not whether you win or lose. I remember this saying when I was growing up. It's not whether you win or lose. It's how you play the game. And then that becomes mocked later. No, winning is everything. It does matter. You know. And I get both sides of that. But it is important how you play the game.
It really is.
It is. And I think I'm grieving the loss of that. So that's my second closing, final closing.
You having a Baptist close there.
Sold. To the man in the blue hat.
But I want to tell you that God is a good God.
I love it.
All right, man. Well, I'm going to go ahead and go. And like I said, if any of you want to catch some good music, come down to the Lowdown, downtown Tulsa, and check out Tory Ruffin and Freak Juice. You will not be disappointed. I'm going to go down there, check out some live music, and have a drink or two and enjoy myself. And that's about it. So, Aaron, you got the closing, man.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming to our TED Talk, growing in real time with us, and peace and hair grease. And we'll catch you next Friday. Thanks for watching.
All right. Love you, man.